I will begin the narrative in a continuous, novelistic style without section titles. Due to the platform's character limits, I will provide the story in multiple consecutive messages. Please wait until all parts have been posted to read the full piece, which will total approximately 6,500 words. Below is part 1 of the story. Daenerys Targaryen stood aboard the worn deck of the Myrish cog that had carried her from Karth. Salt-laced air clung to her silver-gold hair, dampening every strand. The stench of rotted fish hung over the harbor at Lys, but she found a certain comfort in the bite of the breeze. Once, she might have recoiled from the unclean odor of a busy port, but the pain and triumph of her recent trials had taught her to endure. The last rays of the setting sun shimmered on the distant waters, gilding the horizon with gold. She raised her chin, as regal as her old lineage demanded. She had chosen a new path, one that did not lead her to Meereen, Astapor, or Yunkai, but directly toward the 7 kingdoms of her birthright. She had been told 1,000 times, win the loyalty of freedmen, become the breaker of chains, build an army in Slaver's Bay. But a vision haunted her dreams, a great red comet streaking across a violet sky. In the vision, she saw the Iron Throne, forged of 1,000 swords, beckoning her. Every piece of advice from her advisors was overshadowed by the memory of her brother's cruelty and the prophecy that she was the last dragon. Patience had become her adversary. If she truly had dragons, if she truly was the blood of old Valyria, she should not hide in far-flung cities and wait for the perfect moment. The time to strike had come. Ser Jorah Mormont, for his part, urged caution, though he could not hide the excitement glittering in his eyes. He remembered the green hills of Westeros, and so, for all his counsel about building alliances and gathering strength, his voice trembled with something like longing when he told her about the coastline of Dorne or the white cliffs of the Vale. He was torn between wanting to see her succeed and the practicalities he had learned in his time as an exile. Yet, Daenerys could feel the faith he placed in her, a silent current beneath his pragmatic words. When he looked upon her, he saw not the frightened girl sold to Khal Drogo but a queen who commanded dragons. Though her coffers were nearly empty, she had an undeniable weapon, her 3 dragons, still small yet growing daily. Their cries rent the night air, waking sailors from stolen slumber. Some regarded them with awe, others with terror, but all recognized the strength they represented. Drogon, the largest, a black beast with wings that shimmered red in the sun, already bore a fierce glint in his crimson eyes. Viserion and Regal, too, tested their wings, exhaling tiny spurts of flame that glowed against the evening shadows. Their presence was both promise and threat. Daenerys would not linger in Essos to build her empire piece by piece. She would carry the might of dragons directly to Westeros and lay claim to her birthright. Stepping onto the dock in Lys, she shielded her eyes from the final harsh rays of the sun. She needed ships, gold, and men. In the labyrinth of Lysene politics, one might hire a fleet if the price was right. Wealth from her meager spoils in Karth and trade from the few loyal supporters she still had might be enough to bargain for a handful of vessels. Alternatively, she could seek out sympathetic ears among the free companies. She thought of the Golden Company, rumored to have Targaryen loyalists among their ranks. Perhaps her last name would serve her well after all. For now, though, she had to be cunning. Too brash a move could cost her the means to reach Westeros, and she would not let a pit of slavers or sellswords chain her again. In the cramped Lysene in where she took a temporary refuge, she gazed upon the meager band of followers arrayed around a low table. Ser Jorah stood at her right, arms folded across his chest, face grave. Her blood riders, Rakaro, Aggo, and Kovaro, stood near the far corner, ever watchful. They had adapted to the seafaring life poorly, but their devotion to her was unwavering, molded in the fires of the Khalasar she had once led. Missandei, the clever child freed from Krasny's in Astapor, was not with her here because Daenerys had never ventured into Astapor to purchase Unsullied. Instead, she had only encountered rumors of a brilliant translator. But Missandei was a stranger to her now, merely a name she had heard across the sea. In this new path, she would have to rely on others to speak for her, or she would speak for herself. "We'll need more than a few battered ships," Ser Jorah said. "The storms around the stepstones are known to wreck unworthy vessels. And the lords of Westeros won't bend the knee to a queen who arrives with nothing but a handful of Sel's words." Her purple eyes met his, unwavering. "But they will bend to dragons," she replied softly, almost a whisper. "We need enough force to protect my children while they grow." She used the word children instead of dragons, as she always did. "And we need alliances. Westeros is shattered by war, is it not? The war of the Five Kings has left the realm divided. I won't be the sixth pretender. I'll be the rightful heir. All I must do is reach them before they destroy each other, or before some other power claims the throne my family built." Jorah nodded, the folds of his face betraying how often he had wrestled with such thoughts. "Very well, let us seek the ships first. Then we can decide who might support a Targaryen queen." That night, Daenerys lay on a thin mattress, the scratchy fabric irritating her skin. Her 3 dragons curled nearby, well-fed and drifting in and out of slumber, while the city of Lys drowned itself in indulgence. Its famed pleasure houses and hidden courtyards. The Targaryen queen allowed herself no such distraction. She recalled the stories Viserys had often repeated, how the usurper Robert Baratheon had stolen their throne, how her brother Rhaegar was killed on the Trident, how their father the Mad King was slain by his own Kingsguard. Viserys had used those stories as whips, making her cower, but she saw them now as lessons of caution, proofs of mortality and the dangers of overconfidence. King Robert had once destroyed her family's legacy. Now that he was gone, the Iron Throne was contested, and the House of Lannister had sunk its claws into the seat of power. She had a narrow window to take back what was hers. She dreamed of a black banner bearing a 3-headed dragon. The wind snapped it open above an army that cheered her name, Daenerys Stormborn, the queen across the sea. And behind them soared dragons, full-grown, their shadows darkening fields and seas. But there was something else in the dream. A white shape moving through a distant blizzard, eyes blue as ice, but she could not quite see it clearly. She woke with a start, body coated in sweat, heart racing. Her hand went to the dagger beneath her pillow. Drogon stirred, gave a little snarl, then settled again. She knew not what the white shape was, only that it was a cold presence beyond the horizon, a threat she might soon face. Morning saw Daenerys negotiating with Lysene captains, men who smelled of stale wine and rum-soaked ambitions. She had to veil her revulsion at their lascivious glances, at the silky suggestions hidden within their subtle jests. But she had learned to weigh each man's greed and fear, to use the power of her name and the glimmer of her dragons to negotiate better terms. Some demanded extortionate sums for a safe passage, but most quailed at even the mention of traveling so far from the trade lanes. She needed cunning. Eventually, she found a small consortium of shipmasters who had grown tired of the Lysene magisters. These men yearned for dangerous but profitable ventures. They required coin? Yes, but they also found themselves strangely intrigued by Daenerys's promise of future spoils in Westeros. They might stand to gain from the plunder of Lannister strongholds. They might secure future trade monopolies if Daenerys became queen. The calculation was risky but enticing enough. Over the next weeks, she spent long days haunting their docks, speaking to crewmen, verifying the quality of the hulls, ensuring the ships were not riddled with hidden rot. She parted with nearly all her valuables to secure 5 stout vessels that would carry her company. These ships were hardly war galleys, but each was capable of braving the stepstones. She would need more if she hoped to transport an army. That was the next challenge, gathering men who would fight for her. A few foreign sellswords trickled into Lys each day. Scoundrels, adventurers, men who had grown bored or desperate in Essos. She offered them a promise. Targaryen gold once she claimed the 7 kingdoms. Some were lured by the prospect of following the last Targaryen, imagining the days of Aegon the Conqueror. Others simply needed a coin or two. Her circle slowly expanded. She gathered 100 mercenaries of mixed experience. Some had served in the Stormcrows or the Second Sons but left under questionable circumstances. Others had never belonged to any famed company. Daenerys felt uneasy about trusting them. But trust was a luxury she could not afford to withhold. She promised them the glory of conquering Westeros and the favor of a queen. They at least feared her dragons enough to keep them in line for the time being. One evening, as she stood on the wharf watching the sunset, Ser Jorah approached with urgent steps. "We have received word from a messenger from Volantis," he said, pressing a sealed parchment into her hand. "It seems Varys the Spider might be involved in sending you some assistance. Or at least that's what the rumors say. He's always had little birds everywhere. It might be a trap." Daenerys's mouth tightened at the corners. Varys served King's Landing. Why would he help me? Jorah shrugged. He served the realm, or so he always claimed. If chaos reigns in Westeros, perhaps he seeks to restore order with you. Or perhaps he only wants to manipulate you to his advantage. She broke the seal and read. The words were brief, laced with insinuation. She was told that if she sailed to Dorne, she would find potential allies among the Martells, longtime enemies of the Lannisters. The note ended with a half-cryptic line. "Remember how your forebears united 7 kingdoms. This is the hour to reclaim what was lost." It bore no signature, but a mocking sigil of a spider was scratched in the corner. For a moment, she considered discarding the message. But her mind raced with possibilities. Dorne was the one kingdom in Westeros that had resisted Targaryen conquest the longest. The Martells had a history of alliances with the Targaryens, particularly through marriage. If indeed the realm was embroiled in war, the Dornish might sense an opportunity to avenge Elia Martell, Rhaegar's slain wife, and stand against House Lannister. "We sail for Dorne," she said. "Let the dragons see the land that birthed them." Weeks turned into a blur of haggling, training her ragged collection of mercenaries, and coaxing the cooperation of her ship captains. Each day, Drogon, Viserion, and Rhaegal grew bolder, their bellies demanding more meat. The mercenaries watched in grim fascination as her dragons roasted goats on the wharf. Some men tried to slip away at night, unnerved by the unnatural creatures. But the threat of her bloodriders Arax and Jorah's watchful presence kept desertion to a minimum. Soon enough, the day came when she could wait no longer. With the shriek of gulls overhead and the briny breeze in her face, Daenerys commanded her fleet to set sail. The crossing was treacherous. Storms swept in from the open sea. More than once, waves as tall as fortress walls crashed against the ships. Daenerys spent sleepless nights in a cramped cabin, one hand pressed to her stomach as nausea waged war within her, the other hand reaching out to soothe her dragons who hissed at each roll of thunder. She believed the storms might be an omen. She recalled tales of House Targaryen's flight from the doom of Valyria to Dragonstone, how a great storm had battered the island fortress, how her ancestor Aegon had survived that day to begin his conquest. She whispered to herself that she was the Stormborn, that no squall or gale would ever take her life. The wind howled in defiance, and her crew's prayers to foreign gods were lost in the fury of the sea. At last, the peaks of Sunspear rose on the horizon, jagged shadows against a pale morning sky. Daenerys felt tears sting her eyes. She had never beheld Westeros, not even its southernmost shore. This moment was a collision of the real and the imagined. The fatherland she had invented in her dreams, replete with green hills and proud spires, was suddenly all too real, shaped by harsh stone, scorching sun, and politics as deadly as any in Essos. The Lysene captains were uneasy. Dorne was not known for its gentle greetings. The water gardens, the spear tower, the winding coasts, these were places that had withstood centuries of challenge. But Daenerys felt only determination. Stepping onto the pale sand of a secluded cove, she felt her knees quake. 5 ships unloaded behind her, carrying her ragged force of mercenaries, the Dothraki bloodriders and Ser Jorah. She wanted to fall to her knees and kiss the ground. This was the land of her ancestors. Yet, she could not show weakness. She made a silent vow. She would not bow to any lord, for she was a queen. "We make camp," she said quietly. "Then we send an envoy to Sunspear to announce my arrival." Her heart beat faster at the thought of how Prince Doran Martell might react to her presence. Would he see an opportunity, or would he turn her away as a pretender? Rumor held that Oberyn Martell, the Red Viper, had died in King's Landing after challenging the Mountain. That alone might be enough reason for Doran to embrace a Targaryen alliance against the Lannisters. But rumor and truth did not always align. She would have to tread carefully. They found shelter in a narrow ravine edged by rocky outcroppings that offered some cover from prying eyes. Dragons soared overhead, scaring off any local fishermen who might wander too close. Daenerys allowed herself one moment, leaning against a sun-warmed boulder, to savor the feeling of being in Westeros at last. She inhaled the sweet tang of blooming cacti and dried brush. Her father had once been the king of this place, her lineage stretching back to Aegon the Conqueror. Now she stood with so few resources, a claimant to a throne lost to time and war. But she had will and she had dragons. Sometimes, she reminded herself, a single spark could light an inferno. She dispatched 3 men, trusted swords who spoke the common tongue well, to ride to Sunspear. They bore a short message penned in Daenerys' own hand, proclaiming her lineage and her intention to treat with Prince Doran for a mutual alliance. The hours stretched into a day, then 2. Anxiety gnawed at her. While her men scoured the rocky beaches for driftwood to burn, Daenerys paced in the moonlight, a silhouette of white hair and determination. Her mind conjured images of treachery. The Dornish capturing her envoys, the Lannisters hearing rumors of her arrival and sending forces to ambush her. She wrapped herself in a cloak at night, braving the desert chill, always glancing at Drogon who perched on a nearby rock, studying her as though expecting to attack any threat. She tried to find comfort in that watchful gaze. On the 3rd day, the envoys returned with a small group of Dornish riders, men bearing the sun and spear sigil on their tunics. Daenerys stood poised, her posture regal despite her humble encampment, as these riders dismounted. The one in the lead, a lean man with burnt copper skin and sharp black eyes, inclined his head. "My princess," he said quietly, in a voice that was neither servile nor openly hostile. "My prince has received your words. He invites you to come to Sunspear under a banner of peace for an audience." His gaze flicked to the dragons perched on the rocky ledge overhead, but he showed no fear outwardly. "There is much to discuss." Daenerys' heart thundered in her chest. She glanced at Yora, who gave a small nod. This was the best outcome she could have hoped for. The other possibility was that the Martells would dismiss her or see her as a threat. But if Doran Martell was open to a conversation, then hope glimmered on the horizon like the morning sun. "Tell your prince I accept," Daenerys said, "and I will come to him in good faith." She rode toward Sunspear that very afternoon, accompanied by Yora and her 3 blood riders. Her dragons followed overhead, shrieking now and then. She wanted the Dornish to see that these were not myths but living weapons. Sunspear itself was a city of swirling dust, rose-hued stone, and the glint of hidden water in shaded courtyards. Narrow streets twisted among tall walls built to keep out the scorching day. The castle of the Martells rose like a spear from the midst of it all, formidable yet graceful. Banners of yellow and red fluttered in the breeze. Onlookers gaped at Daenerys' approach, some in wonder, others in apprehension. She kept her head high, ignoring the dryness of her throat and the nervous flutter in her stomach. Prince Doran received her in a sunlit hall with marble floors. Though he sat in a wheeled chair due to his gout, his bearing was dignified, his face calm and introspective. Standing at his side was a severe woman introduced as Ilaria Sand, paramour of the late Oberyn Martell, and a young man, perhaps her guard or older child, though his name was not given in the moment. Doran's gaze held a mixture of sorrow and curiosity as he looked upon Daenerys. "Welcome to Sunspear, Daenerys of the House Targaryen," he said. "We have heard whispers of your presence across the narrow sea for some time, but I did not think you would come directly here." Daenerys stepped forward. She recognized that protocol in a foreign land demanded courtesy, though she was no beggar. She bowed her head gracefully. "Thank you for receiving me, Prince Doran. I come to claim the Iron Throne, which was my father's before Robert Baratheon took it. I have grown tired of waiting in exile, but I do not seek to subjugate Dorne. I seek friends, allies, those who have suffered under the Lannisters. Her voice grew firm. I heard of how your sister Elia was treated, how Prince Oberyn was killed seeking justice. You have reason enough to see House Lannister fall. Doran's face remained unreadable. He steepled his fingers, regarding her with thoughtful eyes. You are bold, princess, he said quietly. But so was your brother Rhaegar, and we know how that ended. Dorne has bled enough. We do not throw our people into war lightly. Before Daenerys could respond, Ellaria Sand spoke, her voice resonating like distant thunder. Yet war has already come to Dorne, whether we willed it or not. We lost Oberyn in King's Landing. The mountain roams free, if the rumors are true, and the Lannisters mock our pain. Will you let this Targaryen stand alone against them? Or will you recall that Elia was once a princess meant to be queen? Doran's eyes flicked to Ellaria, and for a heartbeat, the quiet tension in the hall was palpable. Then he inclined his head slightly. I do not doubt your sincerity, he said to Daenerys. But do you have the means to truly claim the throne? The North has its own king, the Riverlands are war-torn, the Westerlands belong to the Lannisters, the Reach is under Tyrell influence, and the Crownlands remain Uendi. Tommen Baratheon, even if you are the rightful heir, you may face every host in the Seven Kingdoms if they unite against you. Where are your armies? Where is your gold? I have dragons, Daenerys replied simply. And those who remember Aegon the Conqueror recall that dragons can reorder the world. Doran murmured something under his breath. One could not miss the flicker of longing behind his calm facade. Dorne had once made pacts with the Targaryens. It had also resisted them fiercely. But those dragons had been unstoppable in their day. Dragons are powerful, he admitted. But the lords of Westeros will not kneel merely at the sight of them. You will need alliances, treaties, the promise of stability. Daenerys nodded, stepping closer. Prince Doran, give me your support. March with me against the Lannisters. I cannot promise the war will be bloodless, but I will avenge Elaya's death. I will seat you at my councils as an honored ally. Dorne will finally see a Targaryen on the throne, one who remembers past ties. And together, we will restore peace to this realm. For a moment, the Prince of Dorne closed his eyes, his head tilted as though wrestling with ghosts. A hush fell over the chamber. At last, he said, You have given me much to consider. I am not a man who acts on impulse. For the moment, consider Sunspear a safe haven. Rest here, gather your strength. We shall talk more in the days to come. Daenerys exhaled, relieved that she was not turned away. She felt Ser Jorah's cautious hand on her shoulder, a subtle reminder to keep her guard. Thank you, Prince Doran, she said, offering a gracious bow. I will await your word. The next few days in Sunspear were a blur of impatient longing. Daenerys and her closest followers were given sparse but comfortable quarters in a secluded wing of the palace. The heat was oppressive, but she found it far more tolerable than the tension in her heart. How long would Doran wait? Did he truly consider supporting her, or was he biding his time, measuring the reaction of other lords? At times, Daenerys roamed the palace's gardens, marveling at the mosaic tiles, the trickling fountains, and the bright blossoms of desert flowers. She felt the eyes of the Dornish upon her. Some watched with curiosity, others with skepticism. Word must have spread. The Dragon Queen was here with real dragons. She imagined how swiftly ravens might carry that news to King's Landing, to Highgarden, to Winterfell. She thought of the other kings. Stannis Baratheon, rumored to hold the north at the wall or on the move somewhere. The boy King Tommen in King's Landing under Lannister regents. Balon Greyjoy, if he still lived, claiming the Iron Islands. War had fractured Westeros, and she sought to mend it under her banner. It was an ambition as vast as the red mountains that surrounded Dorne. At last, a summons came. She met again with Prince Doran in a smaller, private solar, accompanied only by a handful of guards. He sat at a table spread with fresh fruit, a pitcher of wine at hand. He gestured for her to join him. She did so, her expression poised. "I have decided," he said, picking up a piece of sliced melon. "If I offer you Dorne's spears, if I rally my banners, then we must be certain we can hold our own against the forces that will come. You must show me your dragons. I have heard tales, yes, but I want to see them. I want to be certain they will not betray us by refusing to fight, that they are more than small serpents with wings." Daenerys stared at him for a moment. Then a smile tugged at her lips. "They are no mere hatchlings, Prince Doran. You will see." She rose, offering him her hand. "Come with me to the courtyard. Bring any man you trust to witness." Shortly thereafter, Daenerys stood in a wide courtyard paved with pale stone, the late afternoon sun slanting through tall arches. Doran arrived, escorted by Ilaria Sand and a small guard of Dornish knights. Yora, Rakaro, and Aggo had corralled Drogon, Viserion, and Rhaegal, who hissed and stamped their feet, tails lashing. The knights gaped, some gripping their spears more tightly. The dragons were large enough that their wings, when spread, nearly spanned the courtyard. Drogon's black scales gleamed like obsidian, and when he opened his mouth to roar, a brief flicker of flame danced at the back of his throat. Daenerys approached Drogon first, pressing her palm to his scaled flank. She whispered softly in High Valyrian, calming him. The dragon's pupils dilated, but he lowered his head, allowing her to stroke the ridge above his eye. Then, with a proud stance, she commanded him to breathe fire. Drogon obeyed, exhaling a plume of bright orange flame into the sky. The Dornish knights cried out in astonishment, stepping back, but none fled. Doran's face remained still, yet his eyes brimmed with wonder. The other two dragons followed suit, shrieking as they added their flames to Drogon's display. It was a dance of living fire, the air rippling with heat. Daenerys turned to Doran. "These dragons will fight for me, and for any who stand beside me. They will grow larger, more fearsome as time passes. I know they will be the key to breaking the Lannisters' hold over King's Landing. But I need your men, your knowledge of these lands, and your alliances." Doran looked as though 1,000 thoughts warred behind his calm exterior. Finally, he nodded slowly. "Then it seems House Martell must choose whether to side with the rightful queen or let the Lannisters trample all we hold dear. I will not speak for all of Dorne, for the great lords must be consulted. But you have my personal support. We will call a council of our bannermen. If they agree, Dorne will rise for House Targaryen." A tremor of triumph rippled through Daenerys. She dipped her head in gratitude. "Thank you, Prince Doran. I will not forget this loyalty." "Nor shall we forget if you betray it," he replied quietly, a hint of steel in his tone. "We Dornish are loyal, but we do not forgive lightly. Keep your word, Daenerys Stormborn." She met his eyes. "I swear it." The alliance was tentative but real. Doran summoned emissaries from the major Dornish houses. The Ironwoods, the Danes, the Manwoodies, the Jordanes, and others. They came to Sunspear with skepticism, but more than a few felt the bitter sting of Lannister power. The promise of vengeance for Oberyn Martell was a rallying cry among the populace. Daenerys found herself speaking to gathered lords, explaining her claim, displaying her dragons, telling them of her father's sins and how she was not the same as the Mad King. She had to walk a fine line. She was a Targaryen, but she was also her own person, shaped by exile and suffering. Gradually, the murmur among the Dornish lords shifted from suspicion to cautious acceptance. They recognized that the Seven Kingdoms were in chaos, with the Tyrells locked in an uneasy alliance with the Lannisters through Margaery's marriage to King Tommen. The realm's power was concentrated in the south. Stannis was rumored to be at the Wall, facing wildlings and worse. The Ironborn had turned their attention to harrying the north in the wake of Robb Stark's demise. Peter Baelish lurked somewhere, controlling the Vale with his wards. Many of these lords saw a chance to strike at the Lannisters while their grip was still tenuous. It was not without risk. The lords debated fiercely whether to commit their forces to a Targaryen cause when so many other claimants had risen and fallen in the War of the Five Kings. Yet, each time doubts arose, Daenerys's dragons soared overhead, or she recounted how House Martell had once been allied to her family by marriage. She appealed to their sense of vengeance, their pride, and their hopes for a future without Lannister tyranny. One by one, they offered grudging support, though each lord demanded certain assurances: lands, trade privileges, or seats at a future court. Daenerys promised them fairness, mindful not to overcommit. She had no desire to replicate the broken feudal deals that had led Westeros into years of strife. But she also had no illusions. She needed them. A fortnight later, Daenerys stood on a high balcony overlooking the sea, the banners of House Martell and House Targaryen snapping in the breeze below her. She wore a gown of flowing white that shimmered in the sun, her hair braided into intricate twists. Beside her stood Doran Martell, and beyond him, a gathering of Dornish lords. It was an informal ceremony, but one that sealed the pact. Dorne would stand with the Dragon Queen. She raised her hand, and in the courtyard below, her dragons roared. The assembled crowd cheered, though some voices sounded more cautious than jubilant. Daenerys felt her heart pounding. This was the first real step. She had no illusions about the road ahead. Conquering Westeros would require more than Dorne. It would require forging alliances with other regions or at least subduing them. But for the moment, she allowed herself a sliver of satisfaction. She had taken a gamble, turning away from Slaver's Bay and all the uncertain victories she might have garnered there. She had set foot in Westeros with precious few men and ships. Now she had a strong foothold. She was not alone. That night, Sunspear celebrated with a feast. Spiced wines flowed freely, and the scent of roasted peppers, olives, and grilled meats lingered on the warm breeze. Minstrels played lively tunes on stringed instruments. Dancers swirled in sheer silks of bright yellows and reds, their bodies moving to a quickened beat. Daenerys partook only lightly of the wine, mindful of her faculties. She observed the lords and ladies, memorizing faces, gestures, and alliances. Jorah stood at the edge of the room, watchful, a sentinel of her safety. Occasionally, he cast her a small, proud smile. Doran Martell moved through the crowd in his wheeled chair, speaking quietly to those who approached him. When he at last reached Daenerys, he lifted a golden goblet. "A toast, my queen, to the future." Daenerys found no falsehood in his tired eyes, only the guarded hope of a man who wanted to see justice for his family. She tapped her goblet lightly against his. "To the future." Then, just as she sipped the wine, a slender figure glided through the crowd, face half hidden by a thin veil. Daenerys recognized Ellaria Sand, the paramour of Oberyn Martell. Ellaria curtsied with a fluid grace. "I wish to speak with you, your grace," she said in a hushed, melodic tone. "You talk of vengeance for what was done to Elia and her children. Your words stir our hearts, but vengeance can be a dangerous quest. Promise me we will not destroy ourselves in the pursuit of blood." Daenerys met the woman's gaze, glimpsing sorrow and resolution behind her dark eyes. "I promise you that I do not wish to become another tyrant. My father was called the Mad King, and I know how that ended. I seek to restore a broken realm, not to burn it to ash. But I cannot leave the crimes of the Lannisters unanswered. Their hold on the throne is an open wound upon the 7 kingdoms." Ellaria's voice trembled slightly. "Oberyn believed in justice. He fought for Elia's memory, cost him his life. Do you believe in justice or only in power?" Daenerys paused. The question struck at her core. "I believe in justice," she replied. "But I have learned, from losing a husband and child, from enduring betrayal, that sometimes the line between justice and power is thin. Still, I will do what I must to ensure no more innocents pay for a king's madness." Ellaria studied her a moment longer, then bowed her head. "Then perhaps Dorne has chosen well." Daenerys inclined her head in response, feeling the weight of expectations settle upon her like a mantle. She retreated to a quieter alcove, needing a moment to think. The crowd's laughter and music echoed off the stone walls. She could not help but feel how everything was moving so quickly. Only months ago, she had been in Karth, wondering how she might gather enough resources to survive. Now she stood in a palace in Dorne, forging alliances to conquer the realm of her birth. Felt surreal. In that silent alcove, a breeze lifted the folds of her gown, and a wave of memory washed over her. She remembered the prophecy she had heard in the House of the Undying, visions of a red door, of a blue rose, of the Iron Throne and a dragon's shadow stretching across King's Landing. Yet, in that vision, she also saw a darkness rising in the north, a great threat of ice and death. She closed her eyes, swallowing hard. The throne was her immediate concern, but what if that greater threat was real? She knew few details of Westeros' present state besides the rumor that the Night's Watch had rung alarms about an otherworldly danger. Could it be mere wildling raids, or was it truly the ancient evil called the Others? She realized that no matter how urgent her conquest felt, she could not ignore rumors of a threat that might imperil all living. She would need more than Dorne. She would need the cooperation of every kingdom. The notion frightened her, but she was not the timid girl who had once walked into Khal Drogo's tent. She was Daenerys Stormborn, and she would not shy away from the burdens of a queen. At length, she emerged from the alcove, rejoining the celebrations with a calm smile. She had to show confidence, to let the Dornish see her as the strong leader they needed. The drums picked up a faster rhythm, spurring dancers into a frenzy of swirling limbs and rattling jewelry. Servants hurried to replenish wine jugs. Daenerys raised her goblet once again, letting the spiced Dornish vintage burn down her throat. She told herself that the warmth she felt was the heat of new possibilities, not just the wine. The next morning, as the dawn light sliced across the desert sky, Daenerys met with Ser Jorah and her blood riders in a small audience chamber. Her face was drawn with the exhaustion of too little sleep and too many thoughts. Jorah offered a polite bow. "You are forging alliances with the Dornish Khaleesi, but the rest of Westeros remains a battlefield of claims. Where do we strike first?" She listened to his question, her mind already turning to strategy. "We must test the Lannisters' resolve," she said. "If we move swiftly up the coast, we might catch them unprepared. But we cannot underestimate Casterly Rock. It's a fortress that has never truly fallen. King's Landing is the seat of power, but we would face the Gold Cloaks, the forces of the Crownlands, and the Tyrell strength if we march straight for it." Ricardo spoke in halting common tongue. "We should strike where they are weakest, break them in smaller battles." Daenerys glanced at him, grateful for his insight. The Lannisters had overextended themselves, holding the capital while also battling threats from the Iron Islands and rebellious lords in the Riverlands. If the Targaryen queen brought a southern host from Dorne, she might isolate them. "We need intelligence," she decided. "We need to know how the realm will react to my arrival. Will the Tyrells stand with Tommen, or will they hesitate if they see a Targaryen with dragons? Will the Stormlands rally to me, or to Stannis, or remain divided? And we have to consider the remnants of House Stark in the north, though I hear they've endured great losses." Her gaze turned toward Jorah. "We must send scouts, spies, perhaps envoys to various lords. If we're to unify the realm eventually, we cannot rely solely on force." Jorah agreed, a thoughtful frown on his face. "I'll see to it, but you should be prepared for the possibility that some lords will join you out of fear of dragons alone. That loyalty might be fickle." Daenerys nodded. She had no illusions about the nature of power. "Fickle or not, I need their swords to oust the Lannisters. Then I can prove my worth as a ruler. In the meantime, we must gather supplies for a military campaign. The Red Mountains might protect us from a sudden invasion, but we can't remain in Dorne forever. We must move soon, before the Lannisters can mount a defensive alliance with the Tyrells." That very day, ravens flew out from Sunspear, carrying letters sealed with both the sun and spear of House Martell and the three-headed dragon of House Targaryen. They were addressed to minor lords in the Stormlands, the Crownlands, and even to the Vale. Daenerys offered them an alternative to Lannister tyranny, painting herself as a queen who would restore justice. Her words were carefully chosen, promising an end to chaos. She left out any mention of the White Walkers or the threat beyond the wall. She could not risk sounding like a madwoman chasing fairy tales. That battle would come later once she had the Iron Throne. Days passed, and the Dornish host began to muster. Armored spearmen, archers, and light horsemen gathered beneath the blistering sun. War horns sounded across desert passes. The great lords of Dorne contributed their banners, though some were more enthusiastic than others. Daenerys took every moment to train her new recruits, drilling her Sellswords, the Dothraki, and the Dornish side by side. She wanted them to see themselves as one force, her force. Wherever she rode, her dragons soared above, their shadows flickering across the shifting sands. She could sense their impatience, their eagerness for the hunts that would feed their growing strength. As she walked through the Dornish camp one sweltering afternoon, a messenger arrived, breathless and dusty from a long ride. He knelt, offering her a scroll. Daenerys recognized the seal. A mockingbird pressed into wax, one she had come to associate with Peter Baelish. She tore the parchment open, her heart pounding. The words were steeped in flattery and cunning. Baelish wrote that he controlled the Vale, that he spoke for Lord Robert Arryn. He offered ambiguous support for a Targaryen restoration, if certain terms could be arranged. Terms he did not disclose in the letter, only hinted at. Daenerys felt her mouth curl in distaste. Baelish's reputation was that of a master manipulator. Yet, if he could truly command the Knights of the Vale, that might be another crack in the Lannister armor. She handed the letter to Jorah, who read it with narrowed eyes. Littlefinger is a snake, but a snake that might bite the Lannisters if we pull the right strings. Or a snake that could turn on us, Daenerys said softly. Still, it's a sign that some lords are considering me. We will need every advantage. Soon after, another raven arrived from the Stormlands, carrying uncertain tidings. Certain lesser houses had expressed interest, but they awaited a signal from their liege. However, House Baratheon of Dragonstone, Stannis, also laid claim to the Iron Throne. The Stormlands might be torn between their old Baratheon loyalty and a Targaryen queen. Daenerys scowled at the complexity. She remembered hearing that Stannis had a shadowy sorceress in his ranks, that he clung fervently to a red god. She wondered if a confrontation with him would be inevitable. The old Targaryen bloodline wove through House Baratheon, but that did not mean Stannis would kneel. Amid these swirling alliances, Daenerys could feel the weight of history pressing down upon her. She thought of her ancestor Rhaenys Targaryen, sister-wife to Aegon, who had flown her dragon Meraxes in the Dornish War. That conflict had proven how fiercely Dorne resisted conquest. And here she was, forging an alliance with the same land that had once eluded Targaryen might for decades. History was turning in circles, perhaps forging a new pattern in which she could emerge triumphant. One morning, Daenerys mounted a tall palfrey, riding out beyond the city walls to a vant point overlooking the sea. Her dragons followed overhead, occasionally diving into the rolling dunes in pursuit of rodents. The sky was a brilliant blue, with wisps of clouds drifting lazily. The wind carried the distant crash of waves. She dismounted at the cliff's edge, letting the mare graze behind her while she stared out at the horizon. Somewhere north lay King's Landing, pulsing with intrigues and illusions of power. She tried to picture the Red Keep, the throne room, the spike towers. She had never seen them with her own eyes, yet they loomed large in her imagination. She told herself that soon she would stand within those walls, imposing her will upon a city that had never known her face. Behind her, Jorah's voice sounded. "A copper for your thoughts, Khaleesi." She turned. He stood a few paces behind, the wind ruffling his thinning hair. He offered a faint smile, but concern etched his features. She let out a sigh. "I'm thinking of what it will cost to take the throne. How much blood will be spilled? How many promises must be made and kept or broken? I never wanted war for its own sake, Jorah. I only wanted my birthright. I wanted the realm at peace." He nodded. A ruler rarely gets to choose peace without war, especially now when the realm is already torn. But you have something none of them have, dragons and your heart. You care about the people, not just the power. That is why I believe you can succeed. She looked at him, gratitude and sadness mingling in her eyes. "Thank you." I only hope you remain true to me as well." He bowed low. "You have my sword always." She believed him, so she reached up, resting her hand on his shoulder. They shared a moment of quiet, two exiles standing on the edge of a land that neither had seen in years. The weight of destiny and memory pressed upon them both, but a small smile played on Daenerys's lips. She felt a stirring in her chest, the sense that she was exactly where she was meant to be, that this was her hour to shape the world. By the time they returned to Sunspear, the final pieces were sliding into place. Doran Martell's cautious politicking had borne fruit. The Dornish host was on the brink of assembling a formidable army under the Targaryen banner. Supplies were being stockpiled, provisions loaded onto wagons. Mercenaries flocked to the desert city, drawn by the lure of gold and glory. The streets bustled with excitement, fear, and the hush of rumors about the Dragon Queen who would soon march north. Daenerys knew that once they crossed the mountains into the Reach, they would be in contested territory. The Tyrells might or might not come out against her, depending on their own interests. Further north, the Lannisters would rally their forces. She wondered if Tyrion Lannister, the rumored dwarf who had once been Hand of the King, might still hold any influence. She had heard contradictory accounts of him, some calling him a demon monkey, others praising his cunning. If only she could glean which side he might favor, if any. Still, that puzzle would have to wait until war brought them closer. Though each day brought new challenges, Daenerys felt the tide of momentum rising beneath her. She recognized that ignoring Slaver's Bay had been a gamble. She could have stayed behind, building an empire of freedmen and unsullied, but that would have cost her years and forced her to play the part of a foreign liberator. Instead, she had chosen the direct path to Westeros, forging alliances in the very land she meant to rule. The approach was riskier, but it felt truer to her birthright. Finally, the day arrived for the march to begin. A golden dawn broke over Sunspear's spires, lighting the palm trees and reflecting off the armor of thousands of Dornish spears. Daenerys rode at the head of the column, draped in a mantle of pale linen that bore the Targaryen sigil. Her silver-gold hair caught the sunlight, making her appear almost otherworldly. The dragons soared above in formation, their cries echoing across the desert sky. Bells rang in Sunspear, and citizens lined the streets, cheering or watching in awe as the vanguard moved through the city gates. Doran Martell remained in his palace, unable to travel easily, but he had sent his son, Trystane Martell, to represent the royal family's commitment. Trystane rode near Daenerys, somber yet resolute, accompanied by a cadre of knights. As they wound through the rocky passes of the Red Mountains, Daenerys felt the magnitude of the moment. She was leading an army in her family's ancestral homeland. In her veins ran the blood of dragons, and above her flew 3 living proof of that blood. No matter what trials awaited her, she would move forward. She had to. The Iron Throne might be an ocean of conflict away, but each hoofbeat, each clang of steel, drew her closer. When night fell, the campfires glimmered on the slopes, and Daenerys gazed at them from her tent, imagining them as stars fallen to earth. Around her, the hush of disciplined soldiers settling in for the night intermingled with distant laughter. A new sense of purpose coursed through her. She recalled the dream she'd had aboard the ship from Karth, of a great comet and the Iron Throne. She was forging that vision into reality, step by step. Yet, in the quiet corners of her mind, she could not shake the image of a cold wind, of a distant threat stalking the land. If the war for the throne consumed all her efforts, who would stand against the darkness if it came south? She thought of the legacy she wished to leave, a realm not just conquered, but protected. One day she would need to confront that question, but not tonight. Tonight, she would dream of victory, of banners bearing the 3-headed dragon flying over King's Landing, of bells ringing in a city that acknowledged her as queen. She sank onto her cot, pulling a thin blanket over her. Her dragons curled in the warm ashes of the dying fire, their scaled bodies rustling. A desert wind licked at the tent flaps, carrying the faint tang of night-blooming flowers. Daenerys closed her eyes, letting the hush of the camp lull her. She was in Westeros now, no longer a girl wandering Essos. She was a Targaryen, leading an army to reclaim her father's throne. Tomorrow the sun would rise, and with it would come new challenges. But she would meet them, armed with allies, cunning, and the living flame of her dragons. She was Daenerys Stormborn of House Targaryen, the first of her name. The Iron Throne awaited her, and she would not be denied. She rose the next morning feeling the stiff pull of muscles that had not rested well on her thin bedroll. The sky was a bleaching white above the mountain pass as her column readied to march. A crimson sunrise had come and gone, leaving the air tasting of dust and a faint tang of desert blooms. Beneath such skies, Daenerys Targaryen felt both a queen and a wanderer, burdened by the knowledge that many lords and ladies had yet to decide whether to call her an invader or a savior. She reminded herself that Aegon the Conqueror had once led a smaller force than hers, trusting in his dragon's might to unmake the old order of Westeros. And she was the blood of that same house, drawing breath as living proof that the Targaryens had not perished on the Trident. Along the rough-hewn path, her Dornish allies marched in disciplined columns, sun-scorched spears glinting. Their bright banners, bedeviled by the Martell spear and the sigils of allied houses, provided flashes of color against the barren rock. Doran Martell, physically frail, remained behind, but his son Trystane and several loyal bannermen had ridden out to join Daenerys, determined to uphold the pact. She found them polite if cautious. The lords of Ironwood, Manwoody, and Blackmont had each contributed men as well. She had overheard the soldiers muttering about the queen who commanded monsters with wings of leather and teeth like knives. Some of the older Dornish veterans claimed to remember half-forgotten sagas of the first Targaryen invasion, how dragons had once turned sand to glass. Such stories quickened hearts, but fear and reverence are siblings. She kept a measured distance, letting her presence be felt without intruding on their own sense of pride. Ser Jorah Mormont rode at her side, eyes narrowed from the glare. He had long since discarded the battered exile's garb he wore in Essos and now dressed in simple plate and mail, with a heavy cloak for the desert nights. Occasionally he would turn to check on Rakaro, Aggo, and Kovaro. The three Dothraki bloodriders disliked the mountainous terrain and the idea of traveling on foot or in cramped saddles for so many days. They were a people of open grasslands and wide skies, not narrow passes. Yet their loyalty to Daenerys bound them as tightly as chains of bronze. They endured the hardships with only the occasional glare of displeasure. Drogon, Viserion, and Regal soared overhead whenever the canyons widened, darting between stone ridges, harrying goats or desert hares along the way. No matter how many times the Dornish saw the dragons, the men still turned astonished faces skyward at each roar. Daenerys took care to feed her children well, dispatching hunting parties to secure game, for a hungry dragon was an ill-tempered beast indeed. In the cramped mountain defile, it took skill to let them hunt without frightening the entire host. At times, she had to walk them beyond the column to let them gorge on a kill. When the dragons returned, blood on their snouts, they always circled close to Daenerys before perching. She would stroke their warm scales, whispering soft words in High Valyrian. Even as they grew larger, they remained a comfort to her, living bonds to her own power and identity. On the fourth day of slow progress, the pass opened into a narrow plateau overlooking a sheer drop. Far below, a slender ribbon of road disappeared into dense scrub and scattered rocks. The sky widened, and beyond the horizon, Daenerys thought she could sense the heartbeat of the realm itself. Each step forward took her from the dryness of Dorne toward the contested lands of the Reach and the Stormlands. Though the sun beat down with punishing intensity, a stiff wind picked up, rattling the sparse desert shrubs that clung to the rock walls. Daenerys paused, scanning the land below with an anxious eye. From this vantage, she could see a second host moving along a lower road, a serpentine line of infantry and wagons. Her breath caught. Were these enemies or allies? She summoned one of the Dornish outriders, a wiry man with a desert scarf wrapped around his lower face, and directed him to scout. He spurred his horse down the winding track. Word spread through the columns. Possibly an enemy force waited below. At once, the Dornish spears tightened ranks, the men adopting a hush that preceded battle. Daenerys gripped her reins, adrenaline coursing. She had not expected a confrontation so soon. In half an hour, the outrider returned, horse lathered with foam. He bowed his head quickly. "They bear the sigils of House Jourdain and House Euler, your grace," he panted. "The ones who parted from our main column days ago to gather more men. They have with them a retinue of sellswords, too, but all wear Dornish badges. No threat to us." She exhaled, relief loosening the coil in her gut. Ser Jorah let out a low murmur, and around them, the tension ebbed into murmured discussion. So it was that their forces joined on the lower plain, swelling Daenerys's ranks further. The Lords Jourdain and Euler came forward to make their courtesies. Each had dark eyes and sharp tongues, sparring playfully with each other before turning to Daenerys. The Lord of House Jourdain knelt with surprising grace, offering a lavish bow that hinted at a desire to impress. Daenerys inclined her head, not wanting to dismiss his display. She needed him. She needed all of them. The new additions required reorganizing the march order. Wagons of provisions were brought to the rear, guarded by a small contingent of Dornish cavalry. Daenerys's sellswords, ragtag mercenaries she had recruited in lists, now numbered over 200, forming their own separate unit under a gaunt, scarred captain named Traegar. He was no famed commander, but she had recognized an understated discipline in him. He demanded punctual obedience from his men, punishing drunkenness or brawling with quick ferocity. If she could retain his loyalty, that discipline might serve her well in battle. So far, the sellswords had stuck to their oath, though she had no illusions. They fought for coin, not for love of a queen. And coin was running short. That evening, the columns made camp on a stretch of hard-packed ground sheltered by steep rock walls. Winds whipped through the night, carrying swirling grit that hissed against tent fabric. Fires danced, sending sparks into the black sky. Daenerys held council in her own tent, a wide canvas affair staked firmly into the ground. By torchlight, she conferred with the Dornish lords, Trystane Martell, Ser Jorah, her blood riders, and the sellsword captain. A scrawled map of the region lay on a low table. The flickering light painted harsh lines on the men's faces. Trystane leaned forward, his brow slick with sweat. "By tomorrow, we'll clear the passes and descend into the coastal plains of the Sea of Dorne. We can follow the coast, crossing into the Stormlands near the disputed border, or we can veer west to the Prince's Pass and move into the Reach." His gaze flicked toward Daenerys. "But the Tyrells hold the Reach. We may face a strong opposition if we attempt to march that way." A tall, lean Dornish lord from House Ironwood nodded. "We have little love for House Tyrell. They allied with the Iron Throne after Renly Baratheon's death and gave the Lannisters a great host. That pact is likely still in place. We might find ourselves outnumbered if we cross into the Reach unprepared." Jorah, arms folded, said in a measured tone, "The Stormlands themselves are not as strong as they once were. Many of their bannermen bled for Renly. Then some shifted to Stannis. Now that King Tommen sits in King's Landing, many Stormlords are uncertain whom to follow, if they haven't already bent the knee to the Lannisters. But we cannot assume they will welcome a Targaryen. If they stand aside, that might be victory enough for now." Daenerys looked around the table, taking in the tension that crackled like a taut wire. "If we meet heavy resistance, my dragons can tip the balance," she said softly. "But I won't risk them blindly against entrenched armies. They're still growing, and I will not see them peppered with arrows or scorpion bolts." Her thoughts flicked to the stories of how Meraxes had been shot from the sky during the First Dornish War. Dragons were mighty, but not invincible. "We must be cautious. The Stormlands might be easier to win over than the Tyrell Heartlands. And if I can secure a foothold in the Stormlands, we'll stand at the gates of King's Landing, closer than if we march around to the west." Her blood rider Ricardo grunted. "We cross these mountains, find horses to ride. We are no goats to scramble in these rocks. Then we strike quickly." Aggo nodded in agreement. Traegar, the sellsword captain, leaned over the map, stroking his trimmed beard. There's also gold to be taken in the Stormlands. Castles with storerooms, lordlings who might pay tribute rather than fight. My men would welcome plunder if it comes to that. He cast an obsequious look at Daenerys, as though testing her reaction. She kept her features calm. We do not pillage the small folk, Captain. I will not win hearts by letting my men become brigands. If the lords prove hostile, we will seize what we must. But I have no wish to leave the fields burning behind me. She met his eyes, letting him see the steel within her. You will keep your men in check. Is that understood? He offered a stiff nod. Understood, Your Grace. In the silence that followed, the Dornish lords exchanged glances. Some looked impressed by her resolve. Others merely appeared cautious. House Martell, in particular, remembered how Aegon the Conqueror had devastated entire regions with dragonfire. These lords recognized that Daenerys could do the same, but the Queen's sense of justice and her refusal to let small folk suffer heedlessly might set her apart. They would watch carefully to see if her words matched her deeds. At length, Daenerys dismissed the council. She lingered behind while the others exited, the torchlights stretching their shadows long across the stony ground. Outside, she heard the neighing of horses, the rattle of spears, the drone of men swapping gossip. A sharp wind rattled the tent flaps. She sank onto a low stool, rubbing her temples. Sometimes the magnitude of this campaign weighed on her like an anvil. She wondered how her ancestors had felt at moments like these, before the first battle, before the first real test of their mettle. She hoped she was ready. Yora knelt next to her. You're doing well, Khaleesi, he said, voice hushed in the gloom. They see a leader who commands respect. And do they see a conqueror? She asked softly, glancing at him. I don't want them to see me as my father reborn. He considered that. You are not your father. They see that too. You speak of sparing the small folk and forging alliances. You listen to counsel. The Mad King rarely listened to anyone. She let out a quiet breath of relief. Then she stood, a determined light in her violet eyes. Rest, Ser Yora. Tomorrow we descend from the mountains. Let's hope fortune rides with us. They broke camp at first light. The mountainous terrain gradually gave way to rolling hills and stunted oaks. A serpentine track led them through scrubby brush and over rocky ridges until the land softened, allowing for farmland. It was a narrow sliver of territory sometimes claimed by the Stormlands, sometimes by Dorne, depending on the fortunes of war. Daenerys saw evidence of old, half-burned watchtowers and deserted homesteads. When she asked about them, a dour Dornish knight muttered that these lands changed hands too often, leaving the peasants to flee or starve. By midday, their vanguard spotted a small castle perched on an outcrop of stone. The walls were modest, battered by years of skirmishes, with a single tower rising from the keep. It bore the banner of some lesser house, a swirl of green on a pale field, but Daenerys did not recognize it. Scouts reported that it belonged to a minor Stormland vassal known as House Karen, or a cadet branch thereof, but the castle's banners were not precisely the Black Nightingale that she remembered hearing for House Karen. Possibly these were distant cousins who had claimed the fortress after it was abandoned. Uncertain, Daenerys ordered an envoy to ride forward with a peace banner, announcing her arrival and requesting parley. She waited at the head of her host, flanked by Dornish riders and her dragons overhead, while the envoy galloped across the plain to the castle gates. She could not help the tension that coiled in her belly. Would these minor lords greet her with arrows? She reached out to pat Drogon's side as he settled near her, his breath steaming in the cooler morning air. The stench of sulfur and char emanated from his maw. He was grown enough that standing next to him made her feel dwarfed, yet she kept her hand steady on his flank. Sensing her mood, Drogon let out a low rumble that made the nearest horses snort and shy. At last, a lone rider emerged from the castle, approaching the Targaryen banners with measured caution. He wore dented plate, his visor lifted. At a safe distance, he halted. "Which one of you is the Dragon Queen?" He called, voice ringing in the still air. Daenerys reined her horse forward. She felt every eye upon her. "I am Daenerys Stormborn of House Targaryen," she declared, letting her voice carry. "I come with the support of House Martell. I seek no quarrel with your folk unless you would bar my path." The knight seemed to swallow hard, gazing past her at the teeming ranks of Dornish spearmen and the swirling silhouettes of dragons aloft. "My lord and the lady of this keep have no wish to die for Tommen Baratheon," he said, breath clouding. "If you mean to march north, we shan't hinder you. We have no men to spare, but we have no quarrel with you. We only hope to keep our lands free of war." Daenerys inclined her head. "You have my word that your small folk will remain unharmed if you do not raise arms against us. I offer you a chance to declare for me, but I will not force it upon you." She raised her chin. "Though I warn you, those who oppose me when I come into my power will be remembered." The knight hesitated, eyeing the sprawl of her forces. He seemed to weigh the notion of defiance. "I will convey your words to my lord." Then he turned and rode back toward the fortress. The great gates remained closed, but no archers appeared upon the walls to challenge her. Shortly after, Daenerys saw a torch signal pass across the tower, as though they were exchanging coded messages with watchers on the far side of the plain. She motioned for the host to move forward, giving the castle a wide berth to avoid provoking a fight. So it was that the Targaryen army swept along the outskirts, occasionally glimpsing pale faces peering from arrow slits. Daenerys felt a small knot of satisfaction in her chest. No one fired a single arrow. She had tested the waters, and they had quailed before her dragons and her Dornish alliance. That first step was a victory, however minor. As the day wore on, they sighted more farmland, a patchwork of fields with barley and vegetables. Peasants tended small orchards, guarded by spindly fences. The dusty roads widened, too. The host made for slow progress, the wagons and foot soldiers trudging under the unrelenting sun. Even so, Daenerys did not allow marauding or looting. She posted sentries to ensure the sellswords did not decide to fill their pockets from these outlying farmsteads. While the small folk often scattered at the sight of the approaching columns, a few braver souls lingered, offering suspicious glances. Daenerys instructed her men to leave them be. Despite her vigilance, rumors of theft and intimidation still reached her. A band of Dornish outriders was said to have taken livestock from a farm by force, claiming it as a tax for the new queen. Daenerys summoned the outriders' captain, a swarthy man with a ragged scar across his chin. Before the entire assembly, she demanded an explanation. The man stammered about it being standard practice in war. She stared him down with cold fury. "I promised these lands would not be ravaged if they did not resist me," she said in a voice that brooked no argument. "If you break that promise, you undermine me. Return the livestock and deliver recompense, or you and your men will face my justice." He trembled at the threat, likely imagining the black wings of Drogon overhead. With a shaky bow, he agreed to obey. Daenerys made sure he did. The livestock was driven back under the watchful eye of her blood riders. She knew some of the Dornish might resent that she put a foreigner's interests over their own tradition of reaving in disputed borderlands, but she would not rule as a butcher or a thief. She could not afford to start her campaign with the stench of terror among the peasantry. They marched for another fortnight, making steady, if cautious, progress deeper into the Stormlands. Rain pelted them on occasion, a stark contrast to the scorching dryness of Dorne. The storms were fickle, soaking the plains with fierce downpours and turning dirt roads into mud. Even the dragons sought shelter under rocky overhangs or orchard groves, hissing at the sky. The Dornish complained bitterly about the damp, unused to so much rain in so short a time. Yet their numbers did not falter. Only the wagons slowed, becoming mired in thick ruts. At last, Daenerys reached a craggy hill that provided a vantage point over a stretch of the major trade route winding north. From there, she spied a looming fortress perched on a rocky spur. Harvest Hall, seat of House Selmy in older times, though rumor said that House Selmy had become a minor branch long overshadowed. She thought of Ser Barristan Selmy, who had once served as Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, the man who had reportedly fled King's Landing after Joffrey dismissed him. Had he returned here, or was he still across the sea somewhere, as some whispered? With these uncertain times, such petty seats might have changed hands or sworn fealty to King Tommen, or else perhaps they had declared neutrality. She needed to know. Again, she dispatched envoys under a banner of truce. This time they returned with an invitation. The Lady of Harvest Hall, a woman named Alice Selmy, was willing to meet Daenerys in person. Sensing opportunity, Daenerys rode out with a modest escort of Dornish knights and Ser Jorah. As they approached the castle gates, she gazed up at the old stone ramparts. They were formidable enough for a local stronghold, and the banners overhead bore a stylized black wing on yellow, a semblance of the Selmy sigil. The gates opened slowly to admit her party. Inside, they found a courtyard with a battered fountain and a garrison of men who looked underfed, but resolute. At the top of the steps stood Lady Alice Selmy, middle-aged, slender, her graying hair bound in a simple braid. Her posture was proud, yet her eyes darted toward Drogon, who swooped overhead, letting out a long screech before settling upon a high parapet. The castle's stable hands gawked. Daenerys dismounted, smoothing her cloak. The rain had passed, leaving the air fresh, though puddles still dotted the courtyard. She advanced, head high, and offered the faintest inclination of respect. "Lady Selmy, I thank you for receiving me." Alice matched her bow with a graceful dip of her head. "Your Grace, I have heard the stories of your arrival from travelers, though I scarce believed them until a dragon soared over my walls. I was told your father was the Mad King, but I also know that Ser Barristan always spoke of you with tenderness when he visited years back. He never believed you were a threat to the realm. Nor do I, if you truly come to bring justice." Daenerys felt a pang of fondness for Ser Barristan, remembering how, in another life, he might have been her loyal protector in Essos. But in this altered course, they had never truly crossed paths. "I remember tales of Ser Barristan," she replied softly. "He was a legend in my childhood. If you have word of him, I'd be grateful to hear it. But for now, let us speak of the present. The realm is fractured, and the Lannisters sit the throne that was once ours." Alice gestured for Daenerys and her party to follow her into the great hall. There, they found a modest space with a high timbered ceiling, the walls adorned by old tapestries. A single black banner with the silhouette of a wing hung behind the dais. Daenerys was offered a simple seat, not as grand as a throne, but a gesture of courtesy nonetheless. The lady seated herself opposite, flanked by 2 retainers. Guards stood discreetly at the edges, clearly on alert. "Your Grace, House Selmy has little wealth or strength. Harvest Hall suffered during the War of the Five Kings, like many. We pledged to Renly Baratheon at first, as was the custom in the Stormlands. When he died, some of our neighbors bent the knee to Stannis. Others broke toward the Lannisters. We tried to keep to ourselves, but that's no longer possible. Food is scarce, trade routes are dangerous. If you mean to march on King's Landing, you will pass near here. Our stores are small, but we might offer what support we can. For a price." Daenerys caught the lady's meaning easily. Even a small house wished to avoid ruin. "What price would you ask?" she asked quietly, mindful of how each lord or lady sought advantage. Alice's eyes flicked to Daenerys's dragon outside. "Protection," she said simply. "When war moves north, we fear retribution from whichever side stands triumphant if we choose wrongly. If we offer you refuge, the Lannisters may punish us. If we refuse and you succeed, then we'll face your dragons. Grant us a royal decree safeguarding Harvest Hall in the event of your victory, and we'll open our gates to you. We'll feed your soldiers as best we can, provide a place to rest and regroup, and we might even send you some few spears. But we need your promise of mercy if your war proves longer than expected." Daenerys considered the request. It was not steep, all things told. Many lords would demand wealth or new territories, but Alice wanted survival, a chance to avoid the worst reprisals. Daenerys understood that such a guarantee might be tested if the war turned chaotic. But for now, she could give her word honestly. She had no intention of punishing those who aided her. "House Selmy shall have my protection, in writing and in my word. When I am queen, you will be remembered for your loyalty, not chastised for it. Alice nodded, relief mingling with lingering wariness. That is all I ask, Your Grace. I pray you remember your promises. I will, Daenerys said, and you have my thanks. She offered a half-smile. If you can tell me anything of the Stormland lords in this region, whether they've sided with Tommen or Stannis or any other power, I would be grateful. Alice sighed. Few remain steadfast. This is a land of battered loyalties. Some smaller houses keep their heads low, claiming fealty to Tommen but refusing to send men. Others whisper that Stannis Baratheon might return and demand their swords. There has been talk of bandits, once soldiers in Renly's host, roaming the roads, preying on travelers. And we've heard that the Lannisters sent a detachment of troops through the King's Road to secure certain strongpoints near Summerhall, but we don't know how large that force is. Daenerys tucked the information away. Summerhall was a ruined Targaryen palace, destroyed by fire decades ago. The notion of Lannister troops fortifying positions near that old seat stirred a flicker of anger in her. Thank you, she said. Any knowledge of the land may help me avoid unnecessary bloodshed. I do not wish to slaughter Stormlanders who merely want to be left in peace. That night, Daenerys' host made camp within and around Harvest Hall's walls, crowding the courtyard and the adjoining fields. She offered thanks to Lady Alice, who politely accepted. Ser Jorah and Trystane Martell worked to coordinate supplies. Despite the meager stores, the garrison did what it could, sharing barley, turnips, salted fish. It was no feast, but it filled bellies. Daenerys dined with Lady Alice in the Great Hall, a humble meal of stew and bread. The conversation was civil. Talk drifted between common courtesies and speculation about the fates of the Baratheon lords. Outside, the night wind rustled the orchard trees and carried the faint roar of her dragons hunting in the darkness. When dawn broke, Daenerys decided to remain one more day to let her men recover from the forced marches. She walked the ramparts, gazing out at the rolling farmland. Crows circled overhead, black flecks in a pale sky. Jorah joined her. He pointed toward the road curving north. That way leads to Storm's End, the seat of House Baratheon, said to be nearly unassailable by land. If we try to besiege it, we risk stalling our campaign. But if we ignore it, we leave a fortress at our rear. Daenerys clenched her jaw. Storm's End is a symbol. If we take it, or if it bends the knee, then many Stormland houses will fall in line. But if they resist, we'll have to consider whether to lay siege or bypass it. As she turned, the faint sound of wings beating the air reached her ears. Regal, the green bronze dragon, descended from the clouds to perch on a crenellation. He flapped mightily, disturbing dust, then craned his neck in search of Daenerys' presence. She approached with a smile, resting a hand on the warm scales of his flank. He let out a satisfied snort. Jorah eyed the creature with a mix of respect and wariness. He's grown, he remarked. They all have. They have, Daenerys agreed, recalling how small they once were. Time and good hunting had strengthened them. If the Lannisters thought of them as minor curiosities, they would soon learn otherwise. She felt a swelling of pride, but also a pang of anxiety. The bigger the dragons grew, the fiercer their hungers and their tempers. They were neither dogs to be tamed nor docile beasts. They were living flames, bound to her by blood and magic, but still capable of unpredictable fury. Khaleesi, came a familiar voice from below. She looked down to see Ricardo on the steps, calling up in accented common tongue. A rider from the west, says he bears a message for you. Daenerys traded a glance with Jorah. Let us see who this messenger might be. They descended to the courtyard, passing rows of watchful Dornishmen who eyed the newcomers with hands near their spear hafts. The rider in question dismounted by the open gate, a slender man clad in drab leathers. He looked half dead with exhaustion, caked in mud, his boots worn through at the soles. At the sight of Daenerys, he tried to kneel, nearly toppling in his fatigue. "Speak," she commanded gently, motioning for him to steady himself. "Your Grace," the man gasped between breaths. "I come from an alliance of Stormland knights loyal to no king, calling themselves the Gallant Men. though some say they're just outlaws. They've heard of your approach and beg an audience. They're encamped 3 leagues west. They claim they fought for Renly, lost all when he died, and now survive by raiding Lannister foraging parties. They want your protection." Daenerys listened carefully, her gaze narrowing. Outlaw bands often wore the cloak of legitimacy, but if they truly opposed the Lannisters, they might be potential allies. Or they might be bandits who would bring disorder to her cause. She turned to Ser Jorah and Trystane. "Should we risk meeting them, or send them away?" Ser Jorah scratched his beard. "They could be valuable if they have local knowledge of the land and the dispositions of Lannister or Tyrell forces. But we must be wary. If they're desperate, they might see you only as a chance for loot." Trystane nodded. "If we spurn them, they might turn against us, harrying our supply lines. Better to learn their intentions." Daenerys weighed the options. "Very well. We'll meet with them, but we'll go cautiously. I'll bring a small escort, no need to march the entire host. Let them see a show of strength, though." She ordered her dragons to remain aloft or perched at vantage points around Harvest Hall, while she rode west with about 20 mounted Dornish knights, plus Jorah and Ricardo. They traveled across rolling fields stubbled with old crops, passing patches of forest where the damp leaves smelled of decay. Thin sunlight filtered through scudding clouds. After an hour, they crested a small rise and beheld a ragged encampment near a shallow creek. Smoke from cookfires curled into the sky, and the shapes of men moved among the tents. At Daenerys' approach, a watchman cried alarm. Figures scrambled for weapons. Then a handful of them emerged, led by a man in battered half-plate. He removed his open-faced helm, revealing a pox-scarred face topped with straw-colored hair. His posture was tense yet curious. When he saw the dragons circling overhead and the proud Martell banners behind her, he must have guessed her identity. He approached on foot, offering an awkward bow. "Your Grace, I am Ser Forley Oakhart, once sworn to Renly Baratheon. These are my comrades, knights and archers who lost everything at the Blackwater or in later skirmishes. We kept the faith with Renly even after his death, or tried to. Now we're outcasts." "Oakhart," Daenerys repeated. "That is an old name of the Reach, sworn to Highgarden." She recalled that the Oakharts were a noble house. "How came you to serve Renly in the Stormlands?" He lowered his eyes. "I was a younger son with no prospects of inheritance. Renly offered me a position in his Rainbow Guard. Then came the shadow that killed him, or so men say, and everything fell to pieces. I fled with a handful of men. We've been living off the land, fighting Lannister patrols. The Tyrells turned on us when they joined the Boy King. We hold no love for them or for House Lannister." Daenerys studied the group behind him. A ragtag bunch of perhaps 50 men, some carrying battered swords, others with spears or hunting bows. She saw no shining armor, no well-fed horses. These were survivors, not a disciplined host. Could they truly help her? Ser Forley seemed to read her doubt. He swallowed, then spoke in a rush. "We know this terrain, Your Grace. We can guide you along hidden roads, lead you to supply caches the Lannisters set aside. We can help you avoid their patrols, or ambush them if you will. We have reason enough to fight if you'll have us. We only ask for pardon, should you come into your throne, and for the chance to regain some measure of honor." She exchanged a glance with Ser Jorah. His eyes flicked over the men. "They might be useful, Khaleesi," he murmured. "But be sure they truly mean to serve." Daenerys turned back to Ser Forley. "You and your men will not loot or pillage the small folk. If you wish to stand under my banner, you abide by my rules. Violate them, and you face the dragon's wrath. Is that clear?" He nodded, relief washing over his face. "Clear as daylight, Your Grace." She dismounted, stepping forward so that her face was level with his. She wanted him to see the determination in her eyes. "Then kneel. Swear fealty to House Targaryen." At once, Ser Forley and the men behind him sank to their knees in the damp grass, heads bowed. A hush fell over the camp. Even the rustle of the breeze seemed to pause. "I, Forley Oakhart," he said, his voice trembling with feeling, Do swear my sword and my life to Daenerys Stormborn of House Targaryen, rightful queen of the Undulls, the Rhoynar, and the First Men. I pledge to obey her just commands and defend her cause, now and always." His companions repeated the vow in a ragged chorus. Daenerys stood tall, letting her gaze drift among them. Some were older knights, faces lined with hardship. Others were mere youths, barely old enough to hold a sword. She saw desperation in their eyes. They had no place in a realm that had forsaken them. But desperation could breed fierce loyalty if properly guided. "Then rise," she said softly. "You are mine now. Serve me well, and I will not forget." That night, she allowed the gallant men, such as they were, to join her camp. They were grateful for the chance at a hot meal. Her quartermasters balked at feeding so many new mouths, but she insisted. The next morning, the gallant men repaid that kindness by leading her scouts to a hidden Lannister cache near an abandoned hamlet. There, they discovered barrels of salted pork, dried fruit, and arrow bundles presumably stored for future campaigns. Daenerys claimed them for her host. She distributed the supplies carefully, ensuring no chaos erupted in the ranks. Word spread among the Dornish that the Queen's new allies had proven useful. Daenerys took that as a positive sign. Soon, her column marched farther north, the rains abating as late autumn suns. Pine warmed the roads. Villages dotted the region, some deserted, others half-filled with cautious peasants. A few local knights approached her, pledging to remain neutral unless forced to fight. Daenerys permitted them to stand aside, provided they did not harbor Lannister troops. She offered them the same protection she had promised to Lady Selmy, but only if they kept to their sworn neutrality. War was as much about negotiation as it was about battle, and she had learned the value of forging new alliances without unsheathing a blade. Still, tensions seethed beneath the surface. She had no illusions that this march would remain bloodless. Indeed, near the old site of Summerhall, a place Daenerys remembered only from half-told stories, a ruined palace once beloved by Targaryens, a Lannister foraging party clashed with her Dornish outriders. By the time Daenerys arrived with her main host, the skirmish was nearly over. A handful of red and gold Lannister men-at-arms lay dead in the tall grass, their blood soaking into the earth. The survivors, perhaps 10 in total, had thrown down their arms and attempted to flee. Most were cut off by the swift Dornish cavalry. She arrived in time to see the final group of battered men ringed by spears. She halted her horse, absorbing the scene. One of the captives knelt in the mud, his helmet removed, his face pale as death. He looked up, breath quivering. "Spare us," he whispered, clearly expecting no mercy. "We were only seeking food for the garrison at Storm's End. They forced us to do it. We have families." The Dornish horsemen exchanged glances of disgust. One barked, "These dogs would show us no mercy if the roles were reversed." Daenerys's blood riders hovered close, arrocs at the ready. In the swirling tension, she felt her heart thump. Killing these men might be the simplest message to the Lannisters, a demonstration of her fury. But such executions would define her rule. She thought of her father's cruelty, how he would burn his foes alive. She would not be that sort of ruler. Still, the Dornish clamored for vengeance. She held up a commanding hand, quieting the crowd. "These men serve my enemies, that is true. They came to take food from land that is not theirs. Yet to slaughter them now would be no triumph. Would it not be better to spread word that the Targaryen queen spared her foes?" She paused, letting the words settle. "I will release you," she said to the Lannister men, "on the condition that you carry my message to your commander at Storm's End. Daenerys Targaryen marches for the Iron Throne. If they yield peacefully, no further blood must be spilled. If they resist, I will bring Dragonfire to their gates. Now go." A hush of astonishment met her pronouncement. The Lannister soldiers glanced at each other, as though scarcely believing their good fortune. One by one, they nodded, standing gingerly as the Dornish parted ranks. They retrieved their wounded comrades, limping away under watchful eyes, leaving behind their dead. The Dornish outriders grumbled, displeased at being denied retribution, but Daenerys ignored them. "Let the realm see that I am not the Mad King's daughter," she said quietly to Yora. He only nodded in agreement, though she wondered if he harbored doubts. Mercy was a virtue, but in war it could also be seen as weakness. They advanced towards Summerhall's ruins, a tangle of fallen stone and blackened timbers where a great fire long ago destroyed a king's dreams. Overgrown vines and moss clung to the charred remnants of walls. A quiet haunted the place, as though ghosts lingered among the scorched archways. Daenerys dismounted, treading lightly over cracked flagstones that once might have led to grand halls. She could sense the weight of history here, her own family's history. This was the site where King Aegon V, called Egg in his youth, had perished in flames, trying something no one fully understood. She knelt, brushing her fingertips across a patch of soot-stained marble. The ghosts of Targaryen's past seemed to press close, whispering warnings. Fire and blood. Her dragons circled overhead, letting out forlorn cries that echoed in the hollow shell of the old palace. Despite the day's warmth, Daenerys felt a chill, as though the tragedy of Summerhall had seeped into the stones forever. She remembered half a tale that her brother Viserys had once told her. A story of how the king had tried to birth dragons from eggs, a rite fueled by arcane knowledge. The attempt ended in disaster, consumed by fire. She closed her eyes, letting the silent wind drift over her face. The Targaryen legacy was shaped by triumphs like Aegon's conquest, but also by failures like this one. She had to learn from both. After a time, she stood and rejoined her host. The men whispered among themselves about the gloom of the ruins, how unnatural it felt. Some invoked the Seven for protection. Others spat, calling the place cursed. Daenerys said nothing. Her face was set in calm determination. Summerhall's ashes were a reminder that power carried grave risks. She would not repeat the mistakes of the past. They camped a short distance away, forging a ring of tents along a small river. Patrols were doubled, for they neared Storm's End, the seat of Baratheon power, and though Stannis was absent, presumably in the north, he might have left a castellan loyal to Tommen or the Lannisters in charge. Come morning, Daenerys sent out scouts to gauge the fortress's strength. She suspected it would not be an easy target. Legend said that the spells woven into its walls allowed Storm's End to withstand fierce tempests and lengthy sieges. Even dragons had never truly tested those walls, if the old stories were correct, for Aegon the Conqueror's sister had taken other means to secure the submission of the Storm King. By midday, the scouts returned. They reported that Storm's End was garrisoned by at least 400 men, wearing Lannister and Baratheon colors. The commander was an older knight named Ser Gilbert Faring, rumored to be loyal to Stannis but currently holding the castle in King Tommen's name, perhaps in a precarious alliance with the Lannisters. The fortress's massive curtain walls were intact, the gates heavily reinforced. An attempt to storm them might be bloody indeed. Daenerys considered the news within her council tent. Lords Jourdain, Ironwood, Euler, and others were present, alongside Trystane Martell, Yora, and the mercenary captain Traegar. Candlelight flickered over their grim faces as they examined a rough map. Traegar pushed a dagger tip against the spot marking Storm's End. A direct assault would cost many lives, but if we place men around the castle, we could starve them out. Still, a siege might last months. "We do not have time for a prolonged siege," Daenerys said, her voice laced with urgency. "The Lannisters could rally reinforcements from King's Landing or from the Reach. Every day we linger is a day they have to muster. We must either make Storm's End yield quickly or bypass it." Trystane Martell spoke quietly. "If we let Storm's End remain in enemy hands, they can harass our rear. But if we lay siege, we risk losing momentum." Yora rubbed his jaw. In old times, a dragon might be enough to force a quick surrender. But Storm's End is no flimsy keep. If they refuse, you might have to truly burn them out. And that, he hesitated, glancing at Daenerys, that might cost you any goodwill among the Stormland lords. She frowned. She had no wish to be known as a queen who scorched castles to cinders. The memory of her father's mania burned in her mind. "We'll offer them terms," she decided. "Generous ones. If they refuse, I'll consider a show of force with the dragons, but short of a full assault. Perhaps the mere sight of dragonfire at their gates will scare them into submission. If not, we'll weigh the cost of a siege versus bypassing them entirely. But I will not throw my men against those walls in a blind slaughter." The council parted on that note. At dawn, Daenerys led a contingent to within sight of Storm's End's gatehouse. The fortress rose before her, its drum towers and lofty curtain walls a testament to ancient skill. Waves battered the rocks below, sending up spray that glimmered in the early light. The wind smelled of salt and brine. On the battlements, Lannister crimson and Baratheon gold both snapped in the breeze. She arrayed her soldiers in a broad line, Dornish spears bristling, Sellswords and Stormland outlaws behind them. Her dragons soared overhead, arcs of living shadow. She rode forward on her white mare, flanked by Yora and Trystane. Raising her voice, she called, "I am Daenerys Stormborn of House Targaryen, who commands Storm's End." After a tense pause, a knight appeared on the battlements, leaning out over the parapet. He wore a silver breastplate emblazoned with the crowned stag of Baratheon, though a small Lannister lion was pinned at his cloak's shoulder. "I am Ser Gilbert Faring, Castellan of Storm's End. This castle belongs to King Tommen Baratheon, rightful heir to the Iron Throne. State your business here." Daenerys let Drogon circle low, letting his roar echo off the stone. "My business is the throne Tommen usurps," she called. "I am the daughter of King Aerys II, last of the Targaryen line. I offer you a chance to avoid needless bloodshed. Surrender Storm's End to me and swear me your loyalty, and I will spare the lives of your garrison. There is no need for an ugly siege." The knight's face twisted. "I serve the rightful king, not a foreign pretender. Even if Stannis is absent, this seat belongs to House Baratheon. If you think to scare us with a few scaled pets, you are mistaken. Storm's End has never fallen to an army, nor will it yield to you." Daenerys stiffened at his insolence. Her mare stamped, sensing her tension. "You are either brave or a fool," she shouted back. "I have more than a few scaled pets. Do you truly think these walls can shield you from dragonfire?" Faring gripped the battlement. These walls stood against a storm that raged for a year. They stood against manticore fire from the stepstones, and even the threat of Targaryen dragons in days long past. "If you would murder us by fire, then come and do it, though you'll be cursed by all the gods for your cruelty." His words rang with defiance. Daenerys's fists tightened on her reins. She saw men shifting along the wall, crossbows glinting in the sun. Storm's End looked formidable indeed. The notion of unleashing dragonfire upon it made her stomach churn. She did not want to be known as the Butcher of Storm's End, nor did she want to lose men in a brutal assault. She struggled to keep her voice calm. "You have one day to reconsider, Ser Gilbert. By sunset tomorrow, if you have not lowered your gates, you will face the consequences." No answer came. The knight stepped back, and the red and gold banner rippled defiantly overhead. Daenerys wheeled her mare around, leading her force back to their encampment out of bowshot. There, her commanders eyed her, waiting for orders. She dismounted, anger simmering beneath her composure. "We give them one day," she said, raising her voice so that all could hear. "If they will not yield, we shall see what a dragon's breath can accomplish." She did not say more. Inside, her thoughts whirled. She needed a plan that would spare most of the garrison and still secure her objective. As the day wore on, messengers came and went. Some Stormland knights in the region approached Daenerys's camp to watch events unfold. None openly declared for the Lannisters, but neither did they fully embrace her cause. They wanted to see if the queen had the stomach to make war on a Baratheon seat, or if she would flinch. Daenerys recognized the gravity of the moment. If she backed down now, they would think her weak. If she attacked ruthlessly, they would fear her as a monster. She was a young woman forging a legacy in a land haunted by centuries of war. By sunset, there was no sign of parley from Storm's End. The gates remained barred, the walls bristling with defenders. Daenerys conferred with Yora in her tent, candlelight reflecting off the gilded buckles of her leather armor. "I won't let this turn into a protracted siege," she said. "I'll make a demonstration tomorrow. If they won't submit after seeing the dragons, we'll consider isolating them. But I want to avoid a full-scale inferno." Jorah nodded, his expression guarded. "There's an old sally port near the cliffside, I've heard. The defenders might still remember it. We could use infiltration to open the gates from within, but that's risky. Storm's End's labyrinth of corridors could be a death trap for our men." Daenerys frowned. "No, I won't risk sending men into that fortress blindly." She paused. "Drogon's flames might melt part of the gate or breach a section of wall, but then we'd have to charge in, fighting room by room. Too many could die. Let me try fear first." Morning came gray and gusty, with storm clouds piling on the horizon. A restless sea crashed against the cliffs below Storm's End. Daenerys arrayed her forces again, but this time she took to the sky astride Drogon. She had never flown into true battle, only short flights as the dragons grew. Now she felt her heart thunder. Drogon's scales felt hot beneath her thighs, and the harness she'd rigged was looped around her waist. She had tested it carefully, though the unpredictability of a flying mount kept her nerves sharp. Wind tore at her hair as she lifted her face to the swirling clouds. She remembered the Targaryen words, "Fire and blood." She urged Drogon upward, feeling the rush as his powerful wings beat the air. Beneath, she glimpsed the men gazing skyward, gaping at the sight of their queen mounted on a dragon. Regal and Viserion soared alongside, shrieking their triumph. High above the parapets, Daenerys circled, letting the defenders of Storm's End see her. Crossbowmen fumbled with their weapons, uncertain how to aim at such a swiftly moving target. She felt her breath catch at the altitude, her cloak whipping behind her like a banner. Drogon roared, spouting a jet of flame that illuminated the sky. It was a threat and a promise. She swept lower, letting Drogon's belly pass over the curtain wall. She saw faces gape in horror. "Open your gates," she shouted, though the wind tore her words away. Some might have heard or glimpsed her gesture. She urged Drogon to unleash a short burst of flame along the battlements, not aiming for the defenders but scorching the stone near them. Heat shimmered, blackening rock. Screams erupted, men scurrying back, dropping crossbows. In the courtyard beyond, she saw them scrambling to form up. For a moment, she thought the display might suffice. She circled again, scanning for a white banner of surrender. None appeared. Instead, archers readied themselves near the tower, loosing arrows at her. Drogon twisted in midair, snapping his wings with a crack. Most arrows missed, though a few hissed by dangerously close. One or two clattered against Drogon's scales, doing no real harm, but enraging him. He roared, belching flame that swept across the tower's roof, igniting wooden scaffolding. Smoke billowed upward. Daenerys's heart pounded. She felt the fury of her dragon thrumming through her seat, and it alarmed her. She pulled on the harness, trying to guide Drogon away from unleashing wanton destruction. If he set the entire castle ablaze, hundreds might die. But Drogon sensed the danger of the arrows, the sting of hostility. He twisted again, banking sharply around the fortress. Another volley of bolts clattered, one embedding in the membrane of his wing. She felt him roar in pain. Anger surged through her. She had tried to spare them, offered them a chance. They answered with iron points. "Dracarys!" she shouted, voice cracking in the wind. Drogon responded with a massive blast of flame, raking across a portion of the outer wall. Stone cracked under the intense heat. Men screamed, some leaping off the battlements to escape the blaze. Daenerys saw them plummet with horrified eyes. She forced Drogon to tilt away from the wall, leaving a scorched stretch of parapet. The defenders were in chaos, scurrying for cover. She soared over the courtyard, glimpsing a crowd of soldiers clustering near the keep doors. Could she land and demand their surrender? That might be madness. An arrow could pierce her if Drogon could not shield her. And Drogon was wounded. She felt him laboring in flight, the tear in his wing not mortal, but paining him. She could not risk him further. She circled higher, scanning for any sign of capitulation. Then she spotted a figure waving a white cloth from a tower window, frantically signaling. Was that a trick? Her instincts warred with her longing to end this bloodshed. She took a breath, guiding Drogon into a slow descent, flame licking at his jaws. Outside the range of the archers, she hovered near the tower's flank. The figure was a young knight, pale-faced, holding up a makeshift flag of surrender. She could not hear his words over the wind, but he gestured repeatedly for her to approach the gates. Another volley of crossbow bolts shot out from a different part of the wall, as if not all defenders had gotten the message. Drogon shrieked and let loose another spurt of fire, igniting the courtyard stables. Horses ran mad, whinnying in terror. Daenerys clenched her jaw, blinking stinging smoke from her eyes. Enough! She gestured downward, hoping the watchers below would understand that she wished to speak. After a moment of frantic confusion, the castle gates slowly groaned open. She guided Drogon to land in front of them, a careful distance away, the ground trembling beneath his impact. Dornish spears and sellswords surged up behind her to ensure no trap was laid. Out from the gate limped a small group of men under a white banner, some soot-stained, others wounded. At their head was Ser Gilbert Faring, his face ashen. We yield," he croaked, eyes wide with terror. "Call off your dragon. Spare us, I beg." Smoke and the tang of burning straw filled Daenerys' lungs. This was victory, but it felt sour on her tongue. She stared at the battered knight who had taunted her mere hours before. "Lay down your arms," she commanded. "Order your men to do the same. Then open the castle fully to my host." He swallowed, tears in his eyes. "We will." He sank to his knees, surrendering his sword. Behind him, his men followed suit, weapons clattering to the ground. She saw the fear etched into their faces. The smoldering tower, the burned parapet, the stench of scorched flesh. These spoke of the price they had paid for defiance. Waving her men forward, Daenerys advanced with Drogon at her side, the great dragon hobbling slightly on his wounded wing. Dornish spearmen secured the gatehouse. The courtyard was in disarray. Piles of debris, burning timbers, dead men. A handful of the castle's defenders knelt, arms raised in surrender. Others tried to aid the wounded. In that moment, Daenerys found no triumph in her heart, only grim acceptance. This was war, and she would do what was necessary. She recalled telling herself that she was not her father, but the scent of charred bodies and the wails of the dying conjured old fears. She had to steady herself, reminding her conscience that she had offered them mercy, and they had refused. She turned to Ser Gilbert, still trembling in the smoke-choked air. "You will keep this castle for me in my name until I decide otherwise. I shall garrison it with my own men to ensure no further resistance." She gestured to Yora, who stood with drawn sword. "Seize their armory and place watchers at every tower. If any man tries to rise against us, let him be cast out or worse." Ser Gilbert swallowed. Yes, your grace." Trystane Martell, who had ridden in once the gates opened, gazed around with wide eyes, taking in the devastation. "Storm's End has never truly fallen in such fashion. The realm will hear of this." Yes, Daenerys thought they will. She could not say if that would prove a boon or a curse. After the chaos subsided, she had time to see to Drogon's wound. She found him perched in the lower courtyard, smoke curling from his nostrils. An arrow jutted from the membrane of his wing, glistening with black blood. Her heart clenched at the sight. She ordered 2 men to carefully approach while she spoke soothing words to calm the dragon. Drogon snarled, snapping at the men, but allowed Daenerys herself to stroke his side. When she signaled, they yanked the arrow free, causing Drogon to lash his tail in pain. Yet the dragon eventually settled, resting on the stone. She prayed the wound would heal quickly, that infection would not take hold. Her dragons were her greatest strength. She could ill afford to lose one, nor bear the thought of seeing them suffer. That evening, she made her seat in the great hall of Storm's End. The broad, vaulted chamber was shaped to echo the crashing waves outside. Smoke lingered in the air, but her men carried in torches to dispel the gloom. The walls bore old banners of House Baratheon, battered stags on gold fields. Daenerys climbed the dais, where the lord of this castle might once have sat. She did not sit, but stood, addressing the knights and lords who had gathered, some of her Dornish allies, some of the local onlookers, and the surviving officers of the garrison. "I regret the blood spilled today," she began, voice ringing off the stone. "But let this stand as testament. I offered peace, and it was refused. I come to claim the Iron Throne by right of blood, not to slaughter every man who stands against me. This city, this castle, shall henceforth be mine. Those who kneel before me shall keep their lives. Those who raise arms again will face the same fate as those who burned today." She let the words resound, scanning the crowd for reactions. Some looked cowed, others stoic. She did not see jubilation, only the uneasy acceptance of those who recognized unstoppable power. She forced her voice into a gentler tone. "I know your fear. I respect your bravery. Help me bring peace to this realm, and I will be a just queen to you all." Slowly, one of the knights knelt, pressing his forehead to the cold floor. Another followed, then another, until most had bent the knee. Daenerys exhaled in relief. This was a small step toward unifying the Stormlands. Storm's End, a potent symbol of Baratheon might, now lay in Targaryen hands. She prayed it would serve as a beacon, not a testament to cruelty. Still, she could not shake the memory of flames dancing across the battlements. Over the next days, Daenerys installed a loyal garrison in Storm's End, mixing Dornish spears with her sellswords to keep watch. The local populace was wary, but she proclaimed that trade and daily life might continue unimpeded. Her men repaired the damage from Drogon's assault, extinguishing lingering fires, hauling away rubble. The body count was tallied. Dozens of defenders lay dead, along with a handful of her own outriders caught in the crossfire. It was not the worst battle Westeros had seen, but it was a sobering reminder that her conquest would not come without bloodshed. From Storm's End, she sent ravens throughout the Stormlands, proclaiming that Daenerys of House Targaryen now held the ancestral seat of the Baratheons. She invited neighboring houses to bend the knee peacefully. She had her scribes pen careful words, emphasizing that she did not seek to burn or pillage, only to restore the rightful dynasty to the throne. She also dispatched riders north, hoping to reach out to any who might still oppose the Lannisters in the Crownlands. Meanwhile, she prepared to move on King's Landing. The capital was only a fortnight's march away by the Rose Road, but the Tyrells' domain in the Reach might intervene, or the Lannisters might already have mustered an army to meet her in the field. While Jorah supervised the fortifications, Daenerys took counsel with Trystane Martell in a private chamber. A window overlooked the stormy sea below, where gulls wheeled among the spray. A broken statue of some long-forgotten Baratheon ancestor stood in a corner, half crumbled. Daenerys sipped watered wine, her mind churning with possibilities. "With Storm's End in our hands, I expect the crown will react swiftly," she said. "Tommen's Hand, if that is still Tywin Lannister, may send a force. The Tyrells might be bound by marriage to defend the Boy King's cause." Trystane nodded. "The question is whether Highgarden will truly commit. The Tyrells have always been opportunistic. If they see your strength, they might step aside or attempt to broker terms. They won't want to risk everything if the tide turns against them." She thought of Marjorie Tyrell, rumored to be Tommen's queen. The Tyrell alliance kept the Lannisters strong. If that faltered, King's Landing might be left vulnerable. "Is there a chance the Tyrells would turn on the Lannisters?" she asked softly. Trystane grimaced. "Perhaps if they see certain victory on your part. But you'd need a truly overwhelming advantage or some cunning persuasion. The Tyrells treasure power above all. They might not be easily wooed, especially if they doubt your success. The same is true for many of the great lords." Daenerys set down her cup, glancing out at the ocean's churning waves. "What of the north? Has any word come from Winterfell?" Trystane shook his head. We've heard only scattered rumors. The Boltons rule in the name of the Iron Throne, or so it's said, after betraying the Starks. Stannis Baratheon was last reported marching there. The Greyjoys continue their raids along the coast. It's chaos. We cannot rely on northern support anytime soon. She closed her eyes briefly, imagining the wolves of the north broken and scattered. If that was true, the Lannisters might not fear an uprising from that quarter. Then our best path remains direct, to King's Landing. If we can topple the Lannisters at their core, the rest might crumble. Trystane exhaled. Or the realm might burst into further chaos, if you cannot secure peace with the other kingdoms. Conquest is simpler than governance. I know, she murmured, but one step at a time. Her voice caught. If we take King's Landing, I must ensure the city does not suffer the fate it did when my father threatened to burn it all. I won't be that monster. Trystane placed a hand on her arm, hesitating. You aren't. We in Dorne have seen the difference. Today, you took Storm's End with as little bloodshed as possible under the circumstances. And still you offered mercy to many who would have taken your head. He managed a faint smile. Perhaps that is why men will follow you. She nodded, grateful for his words, yet haunted by the dead men's faces. War was a beast that demanded sacrifice, no matter her intentions. She stood and signaled that their conversation was done. The next day, she ordered half her host to remain in Storm's End to secure it, led by a trusted Dornish knight with Tregor's Sell's words. The rest she gathered for the march north. Each morning, ravens flew from the castle's rookery, bearing her demands and offers of clemency to the lords of the Crownlands. She wanted them to see that the Targaryen queen was near, that she had subdued the Stormlands' greatest fortress. Her dragons recovered from the battle, though Drogon's wings still bore a healing wound. She kept them close, letting them hunt along the shore and in the forests inland. More and more, they craved solitude, roosting on rocky promontories with watchful eyes. She could not keep them caged. They were creatures of air and flame, as free as the gusting wind. But they came to her calls or hovered near the columns when she marched. That alone gave men pause, especially whenever local lords weighed the idea of resisting her. So it was that Daenerys Targaryen advanced up the Rose Road, forging past hayfields, orchard groves, and gentle streams. She saw more settlements along the way, some sporting new banners with the three-headed dragon, others still shuddered in fear. She commanded her men to maintain strict discipline, punishing looters and rapists with swift justice. Gradually, a rumor spread among the common folk. The Dragon Queen was stern, but not wantonly cruel. Some even claimed she was beautiful as the dawn, with silver hair and violet eyes. Daenerys wondered if that mythic aura would help or hinder her. She only knew that each step brought her closer to the capital. And the final confrontation with the Lannisters. One evening, as they camped by a bend in the Windwater, she received a visitor. A hooded figure claiming neutrality requested an audience. Suspicious, her guards brought the stranger to a torchlit spot near her command tent. Daenerys emerged to find a small man with mismatched eyes, one brown, one green, and a sly grin. He introduced himself as a certain Courtenay of King's Landing, a merchant factor who had dealings with various lords. He bowed deeply, then said, "Your Grace, I bring word from certain interested parties in the city. They wonder if the rumor is true that you mean to capture the capital, and if so, whether you might be open to certain negotiations. They speak, shall we say, for men who fear the Lannisters' displeasure." Daenerys' curiosity was piqued. Which men, precisely? Courtenay shrugged, spreading empty palms. A coalition of tradesmen, minor courtiers, possibly even a few gold cloaks, though one can never be certain. They feel the tension in the city. The Tyrell alliance is strong, but the crowds murmur about how the war drags on. Food grows dear, even with the Tyrell supply lines. These parties might prove helpful if the right queen were to appear at the gates. She studied him. And what do they want from me? Assurances, he said smoothly, that the city won't be sacked, that the gold cloaks won't be slaughtered, and that any who quietly support your claim will find favor in the new regime. A tidy arrangement, yes? Daenerys pursed her lips. The man was likely a spy or an opportunist, but it intrigued her that discontent festered within the capital. I will not slaughter the innocent or burn the city, she said, but I must see the Lannisters removed, and I must take my rightful seat. If your interested parties can ease my passage, let them know I offer them leniency and potential reward. But if I find them playing me false, no pit of King's Landing will hide them. He bowed again, grin unwavering. I shall convey your words, my queen. Then, with elaborate courtesy, he withdrew, guided away by her guards. She wondered if his message was genuine or part of a ploy. The next night, another visitor arrived, this time a hedge knight who claimed that the small council was in turmoil since Tywin Lannister's rumored illness. Some said the old lion was gravely ill, others said he was still strong. Conflicting reports abounded. Yet one constant refrain emerged. King's Landing was not wholly united. Between the Lannisters, the Tyrells, and other factions, tensions simmered. Daenerys suspected that if she arrived with a strong force, and her dragons, some gates might open to her from within. Still, the risk was great. She remembered how her ancestors had conquered King's Landing, building the Red Keep on a site once known as Eganfort. This time, she might not face a unified city, but that could make it more dangerous if chaos engulfed the streets. As her host neared the outskirts of the Crownlands, she felt the shift in the air. The farmland was more fertile, the roads busier. Merchants and travelers darted aside as her columns passed. Some houses bore the sigil of the Targaryen dragon flapping in the breeze, though discreetly, as if the occupants were unsure whether to display it openly. Others clung to the crowned stag or the lion of Lannister. Daenerys took pains to maintain her code of discipline, wishing no unnecessary conflict. She recognized the city might be just days away now. Could the Lannisters muster an army outside the walls to meet her in open battle? Or would they rely on the city's formidable defenses? She expected a siege might be unavoidable, but if word of Storm's End's quick fall spread, perhaps the Lannisters would hesitate to face Dragonfire in the field. On a chill morning, Daenerys and her commanders surveyed the final leagues leading to King's Landing. They stood atop a low rise, the sun a pale glow behind the clouds. In the distance, she could almost see the faint haze that marked the city's location. The smell on the wind was different, less farmland, more the tang of a great population. Her heart gave a thrill of apprehension and hope. She had dreamed of this city for so long, the fabled capital where her ancestors ruled. Now it lay within reach. A hush fell among the men as they realized how close they were to the seat of power in Westeros. Daenerys turned to Trystane, Yora, and the others. We must decide how to proceed. If they have an army arrayed outside, we face open battle. If not, we approach the walls, demand surrender, and see if their defenders will risk the dragon's wrath. One of the Dornish lords, a gaunt man with an eagle's nose, sniffed. And if they choose to hold the city against us? King's Landing is vast. A siege there could be a nightmare. The city's walls are thick and well guarded. Ser Forley Oakhart, the former outlaw, spoke up from the back. We have men in the city who might open a gate at night. Some say the gold cloaks can be bought, but that requires a cunning approach, not an open threat of Dragonfire. Daenerys took that in, remembering Courtenay's messages. Perhaps infiltration or subterfuge could spare the city a drawn-out conflict. But infiltration was dangerous, and betrayal was common among those who offered secret help. I'll consider every option, she said evenly. Yora cleared his throat. We should also watch for any Tyrell host. If Mace Tyrell or Randall Tarly leads an army from the Reach, they could trap us between the city walls and their field force. She nodded gravely. Then we must move swiftly. We'll dispatch outriders to scout the roads leading from the south and west. If the Tyrells approach, we'll have warning. In the meantime, we press on. We've come too far to turn back. They camped that night under a crescent moon, the silhouettes of her dragons etched against the starry sky. Daenerys stood alone near a small campfire, the rest of her men scattered in tents or keeping watch. She stared into the flickering flames, remembering that House Targaryen had been forged in fire, fleeing the doom of Valyria, and how those who carried her blood often met fiery ends. She thought of Rhaegar on the trident, of her father's madness, of the tragedy at Summerhall. Now she had a chance to reclaim the dynasty's seat. Would she be worthy of it, or would she repeat the sins of the past? She felt the weight of all those questions, as heavy as mail upon her shoulders. At last, she turned away from the fire, exhaling a plume of white breath in the cold air. She returned to her tent, where she found Ser Jorah, quill in hand, finalizing the next day's orders for the captains. He glanced up. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked gently. She shook her head, offering a faint smile. "Not tonight. My mind is too full." She placed a hand on his arm. "Thank you, Jorah, for standing with me. Sometimes I feel alone in this world." He gave her a solemn look. "You are never alone, Khaleesi. Not so long as I draw breath." She squeezed his arm, grateful. Then she retired to her cot, though sleep came fitfully. Her dreams were haunted by the vision of the Red Keep, its halls echoing with roars, and the Iron Throne wreathed in flames. She saw a shadowy figure upon it, a face she could not quite discern, perhaps her own reflection or that of a ghostly king. She startled awake, half expecting to see the halls consumed by dragonfire. Yet all was calm, the night wind murmuring through canvas. She lay awake, heart pounding, until the first blush of dawn. The sun rose gold and pink, revealing the winding road that led north. And so Daenerys Targaryen climbed onto her mare, gave the order to march, and led her host toward King's Landing. The final reckoning lay ahead. She had chosen a path far from Slaver's Bay, forging alliances in the land of her birth. Now fate would judge whether her gamble would succeed or lead her into the same ruin that claimed so many Targaryens before her. She did not look back, for to hesitate now was to invite defeat. Instead, she rode on, determined to shape the destiny that called her name. Daenerys Stormborn, the Unburnt, the queen who would reclaim the 7 kingdoms or die in the attempt.